Brooklyn was a quiet neighborhood, hiding a man who turned violence into business. Roy DeMeo wasn't the loud kind of mobster. He was calm, patient, and dangerously precise. By day, he ran a crew out of a small bar called the Gemini Lounge. By night, that same bar became a place where problems disappeared and silence was currency. For nearly a decade, the DeMeo crew made money, moved power, and erased anyone who threatened the flow, until their own boss decided they'd gone too far. This is the story of Roy DeMeo, the Brooklyn enforcer who built an empire of fear and learned too late that every secret has a price. It started in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood called Flatlands, a place of tight streets, corner stores, and families trying to make a life out of hard work. Roy Albert DeMeo was born there on September 7th, 1940, the fourth of 5 children in a family that came over from Formia, Italy, a small coastal town in the Lazio region. His father, Antonio, drove laundry trucks for a living. His mother, Eleanor, kept the home. The DeMeos weren't poor, but they weren't far from it. They were part of that immigrant generation that believed work solved everything. But Brooklyn had a way of teaching a different kind of lesson, that survival sometimes meant bending the rules, and ambition didn't always wait its turn. Roy went to James Madison High School, a public school known more for discipline than glamour. He graduated in 1959, the same year as a few names that would one day find headlines for very different reasons: economist Walter Block and a young man named Bernie Sanders. Back then, DeMeo wasn't thinking about politics or economics. He was already learning another trade, the quiet, dangerous arithmetic of street money. By his late teens, he was lending small sums to classmates and neighborhood kids, charging interest they couldn't ignore. It was the beginning of a pattern, using opportunity the way others used muscle. He'd later say that loan sharking was business, not crime. That kind of thinking would define the rest of his life. From 15 to 22, he worked at a local grocery store, training as an apprentice butcher. The skill stayed with him. Not just the trade, but the precision, the steady hands, the understanding of how flesh and bone came apart. Years later, that knowledge would resurface in ways nobody could have imagined. But before the darkness came the losses. In 1951, his older brother Anthony, a Marine corporal, was killed in Korea. Roy was 11 when the telegram came. The kind of message that rewires a family. A decade later, in 1960, his father died of a heart attack. Eleanor, broken and tired, took Roy's youngest brother and went back to Italy, leaving Roy alone in Brooklyn. That's where his story really began. A young man, barely out of school, standing in the middle of a city that rewarded hunger and punished hesitation. And Roy DeMeo, for all his quiet edges, had already learned how to survive. After his father's death, Roy DeMeo stayed in Brooklyn. He was 20, restless, and suddenly without anyone to answer to. The Flatlands neighborhood was changing, factories closing, junkyards multiplying, and the lines between honest work and criminal hustle growing thin. DeMeo found his way into that gray zone fast. He had the charm for business and the cold patience for crime. What started as small loans to desperate mechanics and car dealers turned into something larger, a system. He wasn't breaking legs. He was collecting debts like a banker. Only the interest rates were higher and the consequences were final. By the early 1960s, Roy was doing business with men who didn't appear in the phone book. The Brooklyn faction of the Lucchese crime family controlled most of the towing companies and junkyards in the area. They moved stolen cars through a network that stretched from Canarsie to Queens. Roy, with his butcher's discipline and a head for numbers, fit right in. He wasn't a killer yet. He was a moneyman, sharp, careful, always looking for leverage. He'd lend cash to car thieves to fund their operations, then take a cut from every stolen vehicle that passed through his connections. It was safe, steady, and invisible. DeMeo kept his public face clean. To his neighbors, he was an ambitious young man in the car business. To the mob, he was becoming valuable, a new kind of earner who didn't need to flash a gun to command respect. But every dollar tied him closer to the underworld. The junkyards, the garages, the late-night meetings, All of it pulled him deeper into a world where silence meant survival. By the mid-1960s, word started to travel beyond the Lucchese network. In Brooklyn, reputation was currency, and Roy DeMeo was building one fast, a man who could make money flow in any direction he wanted. It wouldn't be long before someone higher up noticed, and that someone was about to change his life. By 1966, Roy DeMeo's name had already started to echo in the garages and junkyards of Brooklyn. He wasn't a made man, but he moved like one, calm, deliberate, always 2 steps ahead. That's when Anthony Nino Gaggi came calling. Gaggi was a soldier in the Gambino crime family, a quiet operator with deep roots in Brooklyn. He'd been watching DeMeo for months, a young moneymaker running his own loans tied to car thieves, and already showing signs of ambition that didn't fit under Lucchese's control. Gaggi saw potential, not in DeMeo's muscle, but in his mind. The conversation between them was simple. Gaggi told Roy he could earn more and risk less under the Gambino flag. No loyalty speeches, no ceremony, just business. DeMeo understood what that meant: protection, access, and legitimacy in the city's most powerful crime family. He crossed over without hesitation. Under Gaggi's guidance, Roy's operation grew fast. He wasn't taking orders anymore. He was building something of his own. He started surrounding himself with young men from the neighborhood, kids who looked up to him, who wanted in. The first was Harvey Chris Rosenberg, a 16-year-old with a fast mouth and a talent for trouble. DeMeo met him at a gas station in Canarsie, where Rosenberg was selling marijuana to passing drivers. Roy saw the hustle and the fearlessness. He loaned the kid money, helped him buy more product, and doubled his profits within weeks. From there, the circle widened. Rosenberg brought in friends Joseph and Patrick Testa, Anthony Center, Richard and Frederick Denome, Henry Borelli, and a cousin of Roy's, Joseph Dracula Guglielmo. They were young, loyal, and ruthless. Together, they became what the streets and later law enforcement would call the DeMeo crew. They started with stolen cars. It was clean, fast money. They'd strip them down in Brooklyn and move the parts through chop shops from Queens to Jersey. But Roy's real business was lending. He poured cash into every corner of the working-class economy, garages, restaurants, even doctors' offices, charging interest that could bury a man if he fell behind. By 1972, DeMeo had secured a seat on the board of a Brooklyn credit union, a legitimate front that allowed him to launder money and move large sums without drawing attention. He taught his crew that crime was paperwork, not gunfire. And in a way, he was right until the bodies started piling up. In the world of organized crime, money buys protection, but it also buys eyes, and people were starting to watch. Roy DeMeo had turned from a streetwise hustler into a power broker in the shadows. The next move would take him deeper into the Gambino world and much closer to the violence he once avoided. By the early 70s, Roy DeMeo had stopped pretending he was a small-time hustler. He was running a full-scale operation, part loan shark, part car theft syndicate, part criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business. And it all flowed through a single front, a Brooklyn credit union. On paper, he was a respected member of the board. In reality, he was bleeding the institution dry. DeMeo used his position to launder dirty money, cash from car thefts, adult film sales, and drug connections. Every dollar passed through clean with a signature and a handshake to make it official. He even used the credit union's own reserves to expand his loan sharking network, turning stolen funds into new debtors who'd never know where their interest payments were really going. As his money grew, so did his influence. The Testa brothers, Joseph and Patrick, became his closest allies, quiet, efficient, and deadly when they had to be. Anthony Center, another neighborhood kid with ice in his veins, completed the inner circle. They weren't mob royalty, but under DeMeo, they were becoming something the streets hadn't seen before, a crew that mixed business discipline with homicidal precision. They called it a family within the family. The Gambinos gave them protection, but DeMeo gave them purpose. He built their loyalty with envelopes of cash and the promise of power. They met often at a bar in Flatlands called the Gemini Lounge, a dark, narrow spot that would soon become infamous for reasons no one outside the crew could imagine. DeMeo's reach stretched beyond Brooklyn. He began doing quiet business with drug dealers, offering them safe banking for their profits. The mob traditionally stayed away from narcotics, but Roy saw no difference between loaning to a car thief and loaning to a dealer. Money was money. Through these same channels, he got tied to people in the adult film trade, men moving reels of illicit films between New York and New Jersey. The DeMeo crew was no longer scraping for cash. They were printing it. The credit union gave them legitimacy, and the Gemini Lounge gave them control. By 1974, they had the two things that made any criminal enterprise unstoppable: a place to hide the money and a place to make it disappear. But money alone never satisfied Roy DeMeo. He wanted respect, the kind only blood could buy. And the next chapter of his story would prove that for him, killing wasn't business. It was loyalty made permanent. By 1974, Roy DeMeo was running more than a crew. He was running an economy. Cars, loans, and side deals with anyone who could turn a profit. That's how he met Andrei Katz, a young mechanic with ambition that matched his own. Katz owned a small auto repair shop in Brooklyn and partnered with DeMeo in a stolen car operation. At first, it worked. Katz supplied the labor, Roy supplied the capital, and both made money. But in that world, trust had an expiration date. Katz started getting nervous. He didn't like the way the Gambino people talked or the way Roy's men moved around him. When the NYPD began circling the stolen car business, Katz made a fatal mistake. He tried to save himself. In January of 1975, Katz went to the Brooklyn District Attorney's office and volunteered information about the DeMeo operation. He told them about the cars, about Chris Rosenberg, about the money. Within hours, DeMeo heard about it, not from the cops, but from an NYPD detective on his payroll. That's how connected he'd become. To DeMeo, betrayal was business, but informing was blasphemy. He decided Katz had to disappear, not quietly, but completely. He called in Henry Borelli and told him to reach out to Babette Questel, a woman DeMeo knew from the neighborhood, someone Katz trusted. She was instructed to lure Katz to her apartment complex in Queens under the promise of a date. Katz showed up, smiling, thinking it was a lucky night. But the moment he stepped out of his car, DeMeo's crew closed in. Katz was thrown into a van and driven to the meat department of a supermarket in Rockaway Beach, one of DeMeo's quiet connections. What happened next was savagely efficient. Katz was stabbed repeatedly in the heart, then in the back. His head was removed and crushed in a machine designed to compact cardboard boxes. The body parts were wrapped in plastic and tossed into the store's dumpster. A few days later, a man walking his dog spotted a human leg near the curb. When police searched the trash behind the supermarket, they found the rest. Dental records confirmed what was left of the body. It was Andrei Katz. The press called it a grisly killing. They had no idea they were looking at the beginning of something much darker, the first known use of DeMeo's butcher techniques, a fusion of his teenage trade and his adult ambition. That murder sent a message through the streets of Brooklyn. Talking meant dying. And for Roy DeMeo, it was the moment he crossed the line between a man who made money and a man who made bodies disappear. The Gemini Lounge was an unremarkable bar in Flatlands. Low lights, bad beer, a back apartment nobody checked. For the DeMeo crew, it became an office, a clinic, and a courtroom. It was their headquarters. It was the place where decisions were made and sentences carried out. That is why the technique took the lounge's name, the Gemini method. The method was precise. It read like a manual written by men who wanted no mess, no witnesses, and no loose ends. The steps were repeated until they became ritual. First, the victim was lured through the lounge's side door into the rear apartment. Many crew members later told investigators the room felt routine, like a workspace. Roy DeMeo most often played the executioner. Frederick DeNome, who had been DeMeo's chauffeur and later turned government witness, described the pattern. DeMeo would enter with a silenced pistol in one hand and a towel in the other. He shot the man in the head. He wrapped the towel tightly to stanch the bleeding. Then someone, originally Chris Rosenberg, would plunge a knife into the heart. That second act finished the job. They stripped the corpse. They dragged it into the bathroom to let blood congeal or drain. Then they spread plastic sheets across the main room and began cutting. Arms, legs, head. Precision born from years in a butcher shop and years of practice. Body parts went into heavy bags. Bags went into cardboard boxes. The boxes were driven to Fountain Avenue landfill in East New York, Brooklyn, a dump big enough to bury a dozen secrets in a single day. Sometimes the crew varied the disposal. A cabin cruiser owned by Richard DeNome was used on at least one occasion to sink remains at sea. Occasionally bodies were left where they would be found, meant to send a message. But most followed the Gemini routine because it worked. The landfill swallowed evidence. The pace of dumping made detection unlikely. The method made the crew efficient. It made them cold. Law enforcement later estimated the DeMeo crew was responsible for scores of murders. Crew members who later cooperated said the Gemini method removed uncertainty. It removed panic. It removed witnesses. It also created a reputation. Neighbors whispered. Rival criminals worried. Detectives catalogued disappearances. The name Gemini began to mean one thing: disappear and never be heard from again. What began as a toolbox of convenience became a signature. Precision became brutality by habit. The Gemini method turned the Gemini Lounge into a place where money could be cleaned and people could be erased. By the mid-70s, Roy DeMeo's empire had no boundaries. Money was coming in from cars, loans, and now a darker trade: adult entertainment. When a peep show owner in Bricktown, New Jersey couldn't pay his debts, DeMeo stepped in and took control. What began as a way to collect a loan turned into a stake in the adult business that stretched from New York to Rhode Island. Soon he was distributing highly explicit underground material, the kind even the mob itself viewed as crossing the line. Even in organized crime, there were lines, and DeMeo was crossing them. When Nino Gaggi found out, he was furious. Gaggi had vouched for Roy, and now his protege was moving into business that carried death sentences inside the family. He warned DeMeo to shut it down or face consequences. Roy listened, nodded, and went right back to work. He knew Gaggi's anger would fade as long as the envelopes of cash kept coming. It did. The subject was never mentioned again. DeMeo also began financing drug deals, another forbidden corner of the Gambino world. He helped arrange a shipment of Colombian marijuana brought in by freighter and sold out of auto shops in Canarsie. He let his crew move cocaine through the Gemini Lounge. Castellano's rules were clear: no narcotics, no exceptions. But DeMeo saw drugs as numbers, not sin. Each deal was profit, and profit justified itself. The money came fast, but it drew eyes. In 1975, the Internal Revenue Service started asking questions about the income of a Brooklyn businessman whose lifestyle didn't match his tax returns. DeMeo's credit union, already hollowed out by years of theft and laundering, was collapsing. Investigators were closing in on what was left of the accounts. Before an indictment could land, DeMeo produced a stack of false affidavits, statements from friendly business owners claiming he worked for them. It was enough to settle with the IRS. The case disappeared, just like so many of his problems. But the damage was done. The credit union folded, and with it went the illusion of legitimacy. DeMeo's operation was no longer hiding behind paperwork. It was powered by fear, cash, and the loyalty of men who depended on him to survive. By 1976, Roy DeMeo had stopped being a hustler. He was something else entirely, a mob financier with a killer's discipline. And in the shadows of Brooklyn, his next move would connect him to the highest levels of the Gambino family. In the fall of 1976, the ground under New York's underworld shifted. Carlo Gambino, The quiet Don who had ruled his family with discipline and calculation died of natural causes. His death left a power vacuum in one of the city's most profitable and dangerous organizations. The leadership didn't pass through blood or seniority, it passed through strategy. Paul Castellano, Carlo's cousin and longtime lieutenant, took control. Agnello della Croce, the feared underboss who represented the old-school street faction, was kept in place as second-in-command. The family split in spirit that day, white-collar on one side, street killers on the other. For Nino Gaggi, the shift was good news. Castellano promoted him to capo regime, putting him in charge of his own crew. That meant Gaggi now had real power and that DeMeo, his top earner, was closer than ever to the center of the Gambino world. Roy wanted more than proximity. He wanted to be made officially inducted, recognized as a member of the family he'd already been working for. But Castellano didn't see him that way. To Paul, DeMeo was useful but crude, too close to the streets, too unpredictable. Castellano built his empire on businessmen in suits, not men who cut throats in Brooklyn apartments. Every time Gaggi tried to put DeMeo's name forward, Castellano refused. It didn't matter how much money Roy brought in, the answer stayed no. So DeMeo kept proving his worth the only way he knew how, by earning. He expanded the crew's reach into truck hijackings out of John F. Kennedy International Airport. The targets were simple: delivery trucks loaded with electronics, clothing, cigarettes, anything that could move fast and sell faster. DeMeo's new recruit, Edward "Danny" Grillo, was fresh out of prison and already known for taking trucks at gunpoint. He fit right into the operation. Within months, the hijackings were feeding DeMeo's network of fences and chop shops, adding another steady flow of cash to the crew's accounts. Brooklyn was changing. The new Gambino boss wore tailored suits and dined in Staten Island mansions, but the blood and money still came from men like Roy DeMeo. He wasn't made, but he was making money for everyone above him, and in the mafia, that could buy protection, at least for a while. By 1977, Roy DeMeo had everything but the one thing he wanted most: a button, the mark of a made man in the Gambino family. He was earning more than soldiers, running a crew that handled loans, cars, and bodies, but he was still an associate. Paul Castellano kept him at arm's length, calling him a street butcher. Roy needed something bigger to prove his worth. Opportunity came from the west side of Manhattan, Hell's Kitchen, where the Irish mob still held ground. Their boss, Mickey Spillane, was old school, keeping the neighborhood tight and the money close. His rival, James "Jimmy" Coonan, was young, hungry, and brutal. Castellano had business interests tied to the construction of the new Jacob K. Javits Convention Center, but Spillane's control of the unions slowed progress. The Gambinos wanted him gone. In May 1977, Spillane was shot to death outside his apartment in Woodside, Queens. 5 bullets, no witnesses. Rumor spread that Danny Grillo and Roy DeMeo handled the job as a favor to Coonan. It was never proven, but the timing was perfect. With Spillane out of the way, Coonan took control of the Westies, the Irish gang that ran the West Side. DeMeo saw the potential before anyone else did. He approached Gaggi with an idea: bring the Westies under the Gambino umbrella. Irish muscle, Italian organization. Gaggi liked the math and took it to Castellano. A meeting was arranged. In a quiet sit-down, Coonan and his right-hand man, Mickey Featherstone, agreed to a deal. The Westies would work as an enforcement arm for the Gambinos, taking 10% of everything they earned and kicking the rest up. In return, they'd get union access, protection, and a steady flow of contracts, the kind that paid in both cash and blood. For Castellano, the alliance meant power in Manhattan. For Coonan, it meant survival. For DeMeo, it meant everything. His success with the Westies finally changed Castellano's mind. After years of hesitation, Roy DeMeo was formally inducted into the Gambino family in mid-1977. The butcher from Flatlands was now a made man. But with the title came rules: no drugs, no unsanctioned killings, no personal wars. Castellano made that clear. DeMeo nodded, accepted the oath, and went back to Brooklyn. Within months, he'd break every one of those rules. By 1978, the DeMeo crew had turned into a machine, efficient, profitable, and lethal. But machines break from the inside first. Roy DeMeo's biggest threat wasn't law enforcement or rival families. It was the men sitting at his own table. The first to fall was Edward "Danny" Grillo, a hijacker who had once brought muscle and connections to the crew. Grillo had slipped, gambling debts, drugs, and talk that made people nervous. DeMeo couldn't afford either weakness or witnesses. One night, Grillo was summoned to the Gemini Lounge under the usual pretext. A meeting, a drink, a handshake. He never came out. His body was carved up and made to disappear. For the crew, it was a reminder. Loyalty was permanent, but membership wasn't. Then came a mistake that would haunt DeMeo for the rest of his life. In the spring of 1979, Roy noticed a car parked near his house in Massapequa Park, Long Island. The driver sat there for hours taking notes. DeMeo assumed it was a Cuban hitman connected to a failed drug deal that had gone bad weeks earlier. He gathered two of his men, Joseph Dracula Guglielmo and Frederick Dinome, and followed the car through the streets. What followed was a 7-mile chase down Route 110 through Amityville and Farmingdale. When the car finally stopped, DeMeo stepped out and opened fire. The driver slumped over the wheel. Only afterward did DeMeo realize the truth. The man wasn't a killer or a dealer. He was 18-year-old Dominic Ragucci, a college student selling door-to-door to pay for school. DeMeo drove home shaking. According to his son Albert, he broke down in tears and refused to eat for days. His wife Gladys saw the guilt that the business usually hid. It was one of the few times Roy couldn't explain away what he'd done. But guilt doesn't erase orders, and Castellano was still watching. He'd warned DeMeo to stay away from narcotics, but Chris Rosenberg, Roy's protege and closest friend, had gone off script. Rosenberg killed several Cuban drug dealers during a deal gone bad in Florida. The Cubans demanded retribution. Castellano gave the word. Rosenberg had to die. DeMeo resisted. He stalled for weeks trying to buy time, trying to find a way out. But the family's rules were clear. Disobedience meant death. On May 11th, 1979, Rosenberg showed up for the crew's regular Friday night meeting at the Gemini Lounge. When he walked in, DeMeo raised his pistol and shot him once in the head. Rosenberg fell but somehow got to his knees, dazed. Anthony Center stepped in and finished the job with 4 more shots. This time they didn't cut the body up. The Cubans wanted to see proof. The crew left Rosenberg's body in his car on Cross Bay Boulevard in Queens, where the police would find it. Afterward, DeMeo locked himself in his study for 2 days. The man who had once been his apprentice, the kid from the gas station he'd turned into a killer, was gone by his own hand. The DeMeo crew still had money, fear, and control. But something in Roy had cracked. The violence was no longer just business, it was beginning to consume the man behind it. By the end of the 70s, Roy DeMeo had built an empire out of stolen metal. Cars were his currency and Brooklyn was his mint. What began as a neighborhood hustle turned into one of the largest car theft rings in New York City's history. A system so efficient the FBI would later give it a name, the Empire Boulevard Operation. The setup was simple, but the scale was staggering. Hundreds of stolen cars were stripped, altered, and reassembled under false paperwork. From there, they were loaded onto shipping containers at Port Newark and sent halfway across the world to Kuwait and Puerto Rico, where hungry buyers paid full market price for vehicles that no longer existed on American soil. DeMeo wasn't stealing the cars himself, he was running the logistics. He had 5 partners handling export and resale, each pocketing tens of thousands a week. The cars were one thing, but DeMeo never let a shipment leave without extra cargo, stolen cigarettes, and sometimes narcotics hidden among the crates. It was global smuggling disguised as commerce. On the streets, the actual thefts were handled by familiar faces. Vito Arena, a longtime car thief and armed robber, joined the operation after killing his former partner. To DeMeo, that kind of decisiveness was a resume. Arena's crew hit lots, dealerships, and private driveways across the city. Within months, they were moving so many cars that Roy had to lease new warehouses just to store them before export. But big money always brings loose lips. In late 1979, a legitimate car dealer who had unknowingly helped move stolen vehicles threatened to go to the police. Within days, both he and a friend who'd heard too much were dead, murdered to protect the operation. Their bodies vanished the way all DeMeo's problems did. The network grew so bold that by 1980, agents from the FBI's Newark office were watching the docks, tracking containers, and quietly building a case. That summer, federal agents raided one of the warehouses tied to DeMeo's network. They found paperwork, stolen vehicle identification numbers, and a trail of money that pointed directly toward Brooklyn. Two of DeMeo's men, Henry Borelli and Frederick Denome, were arrested in 1981 for their roles in the scheme. Roy told them to plead guilty, take the fall, and stay quiet. He promised their families would be taken care of. It worked. The investigation hit a wall. For now, the Empire Boulevard operation proved something everyone in law enforcement already suspected, that DeMeo wasn't a street thug. He was an industrialist of crime, capable of turning theft into infrastructure. But every empire runs out of room to grow. And in Roy DeMeo's case, the walls were closing in fast. By late 1979, the streets were shifting again, not from outside pressure, but from inside betrayal. The Gambino family was a house built on silence, and silence had started to crack. Two made men, James Eppolito Sr. and his son James Jr., both part of Nino Gaggi's crew, began whispering to Castellano that Gaggi and DeMeo were dealing drugs, a forbidden act that carried one sentence: death. It was a dangerous accusation, one that could have ended both their lives if Castellano believed it. But Castellano didn't. Gaggi had earned his trust, and DeMeo had made him rich. When the elder Eppolito pressed the issue, Castellano gave his capo the green light. "Do what you need to do," he told Gaggi. That was permission, mafia language for murder. On October 1st, 1979, Gaggi arranged a meeting with the two Eppolitos near Coney Island. DeMeo rode with him. They told the father and son to follow in their car, a casual drive, nothing out of the ordinary. When they parked along a quiet stretch of road, the Eppolitos never saw it coming. Inside the car, both men were shot point blank in the back of the head. But the perfect hit went sideways. A passing driver witnessed the gunfire and alerted a nearby patrolman. The officer approached as Gaggi stepped out of his car. A shootout erupted, and Gaggi caught a bullet in the neck before being arrested on the spot. DeMeo, split seconds ahead of disaster, slipped away into traffic. He wasn't recognized, and his name never made the police report. Gaggi faced charges for murder and the attempted murder of a police officer. The case should have ended his career, but this was New York in the 1970s. A city where influence ran deeper than law. Through jury tampering and backroom favors, the murder charge vanished. Gaggi walked away with a conviction for assault, serving a sentence of 5 to 15 years. DeMeo understood what that meant. His protector was going to prison, and the family's eyes were now fixed on him. But before the trial ended, he made sure Gaggi's biggest threat never made it to the witness stand. The driver who had seen the shooting, the only man who could have linked DeMeo to the murders, was found dead in early 1980. His disappearance tied the last loose end. The Eppolito murders marked a turning point. They proved that DeMeo could kill not only outsiders but made men, family within the family, and still survive. But every bullet fired that night tightened the noose around him. By 1980, with Gaggi behind bars and federal agents closing in, Roy DeMeo was a soldier without a shield, and in the mafia, that was the most dangerous place to stand. By 1981, the DeMeo crew had been killing for nearly a decade. The bodies had vanished, the money kept flowing, and law enforcement had been chasing ghosts. But ghosts leave trails: financial records, missing persons, phone taps, frightened witnesses. Piece by piece, those trails were leading to one man, Roy DeMeo. The FBI, along with a joint state task force, began connecting the dots: stolen cars, shell companies, sudden disappearances, and the Gemini Lounge that no one in Brooklyn wanted to talk about. Each thread pulled tighter around DeMeo's operation. What had once been considered an untouchable crew was now the focus of a federal investigation that reached from Queens to the Bronx, from New York Harbor all the way to Washington. Then came the break. On June 4th, 1982, one of DeMeo's own, Vito Arena, was arrested for a string of armed robberies. Arena had been around long enough to know what happened to men who went to prison without protection. Facing decades behind bars, he made a choice that would change everything. He flipped, agreeing to cooperate with federal and state investigators. Arena's confession opened the floodgates. He laid out the structure of the DeMeo crew, who gave orders, who pulled triggers where the bodies went. He told them about the Gemini method, the landfill, the auto theft ring, even the connections to the Gambino hierarchy. For the first time, law enforcement had a clear picture of what DeMeo had built and how many lives it had cost. Inside the family, panic started to spread. With Arena talking, everyone in the crew knew indictments were coming. Some men went underground, others whispered about running. Even DeMeo himself went into hiding through the summer and fall of 1982, bouncing between safe houses and meeting quietly with lawyers. He could feel the weight pressing down, years of secrets suddenly turning into evidence. Up above, Paul Castellano and Nino Gaggi were worried about something else. Arena knew the family's structure, who was connected to whom, how money moved, what names belonged to which ledgers. If DeMeo was arrested, he might do what Arena had done. Castellano couldn't risk that. In the fall of 1982, a conversation caught on an FBI wiretap inside Angelo Ruggiero's home captured the decision. Ruggiero and Gene Gotti discussed how Castellano had put out a contract on DeMeo. The problem was finding someone willing to take it. Gene said his brother John Gotti was hesitant. "The guy's got an army of killers around him," he said. "He's done 37 himself." Even the killers were afraid to kill Roy DeMeo. According to later testimony, the contract eventually landed in the hands of Frank DeCicco, who in turn passed it to DeMeo's own men. Castellano wanted the job handled quietly, by those who knew him best. By the end of 1982, DeMeo was out of hiding, restless and paranoid. He'd survived every enemy so far. But now the enemy was his own boss, and in the mafia, once a death sentence came from the top, there was no appeal. By the winter of 1982, Roy DeMeo knew the clock was ticking. The empire he built, the crew, the money, the silence, was collapsing around him. Informants were talking, the FBI was circling, and inside the Gambino family, his name was being spoken in whispers. Those last months were marked by paranoia and isolation. DeMeo stopped trusting anyone outside his immediate family. He rarely left his house in Massapequa Park, and when he did, he carried a sawn-off shotgun under his leather jacket. Even at the dinner table, his eyes were restless, his words shorter. To those around him, he looked less like a gangster and more like a man waiting for his own funeral. His son Albert later said his father had started talking about faking his own death, disappearing, leaving everything behind. But DeMeo was too deep in the life to ever walk away. By early January 1983, he was trying to settle what debts he could, wrapping up business and quietly saying goodbye without saying the words. On January 10th, 1983, DeMeo went to a meeting at the home of Patty Testa, one of his crew members. It was supposed to be routine, a check-in, a discussion, nothing more. But that night, he didn't come home. At first, his family thought he'd gone underground again. But the next morning, they found his watch, wallet, and gold ring laid neatly on his desk alongside a small Catholic pamphlet. His daughter's birthday came and went without him showing up. Albert began to understand what those goodbyes really meant. 10 days later, on January 20th, police in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn found a 1981 Cadillac Coupe de Ville sitting in the parking lot of the Varuna Boat Club. When they opened the trunk, they found DeMeo's body, partially frozen, slumped beneath a chandelier that had been wrapped with him. He'd been shot multiple times in the head with one bullet wound through his hand. a final reflex to shield himself from the gunfire. To detectives, it looked like an ambush. To the FBI, it looked like a message. No one was ever officially charged with his murder. The task force investigating the DeMeo crew believed it had been carried out by his own men, likely Joseph Testa, Anthony Center, and Henry Borelli, under orders from Gaggi and Castellano. Mob insiders later claimed that Castellano had decided DeMeo was too unstable, too visible, and too likely to talk once the indictments landed. Years later, Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the Lucchese underboss turned informant, told his own version. He claimed Castellano first gave the job to John Gotti and Frank DeCicco, but they couldn't get close enough. DeCicco allegedly passed the contract to DeMeo's own crew, promising protection if they did it themselves. According to Casso, that hit changed more than one life. He said that killing DeMeo, a man feared by everyone, made Gotti and DeCicco believe they could one day take out Castellano himself. And 2 years later, they did. When police pulled the Cadillac into the impound lot, one detective looked down at the frozen face in the trunk and said quietly, "This is what happens when the killer runs out of friends." Roy DeMeo's reign ended the way his life had been lived, violent, secretive, and surrounded by the men who once swore loyalty to him. In the end, he didn't vanish into the landfill. The man who'd made others disappear became a body in the trunk of his own car. After Roy DeMeo's death, the empire didn't collapse all at once. It rotted from the inside out. The murders, the thefts, the loans, the blood-soaked loyalty. The murders, the thefts, the loans, the blood-soaked loyalty. It all came back in stacks of paperwork stamped with the words United States versus the DeMeo crew. In 1984, federal prosecutors unsealed a massive indictment charging more than a dozen men tied to the DeMeo organization. The charges read like an inventory of every crime the crew had ever committed: racketeering, extortion, car theft, drug trafficking, and murder. For the first time, the government wasn't chasing ghosts or missing persons. They were building a case on confessions, witnesses, and the paper trail DeMeo himself had once used to clean his money. At the top of the indictment were Joseph Testa, Anthony Center, and Henry Borelli, the core of the old crew. They were accused of multiple murders, including those of Andrei Katz, Chris Rosenberg, and several unnamed victims believed to have vanished through the Gemini Lounge. Frederick Denome, DeMeo's former driver, had flipped after his arrest and given the FBI a roadmap to everything: how the crew operated, how the bodies were disposed of, and who gave the orders. Meanwhile, higher up in the Gambino family, power was shifting again. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano, the boss who had once ordered DeMeo's death, was gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Witnesses saw two men in trench coats open fire as Castellano stepped from his Lincoln. Those men were working under John Gotti, who used the hit to seize control of the Gambino family. The man who'd once refused to kill DeMeo was now the boss of New York's most powerful mob family. The trials that followed the indictments dragged on for years. In 1988, Testa and Center were convicted on multiple counts of racketeering and murder. Both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. Borelli, who had been serving time for an unrelated murder, received the same. Vito Arena and Frederick Denoma, the turncoats, were placed in the Witness Protection Program, their identities buried like the bodies they once helped hide. Other crew members didn't live to face judgment. Joseph Guglielmo was found shot to death in 1986, a suspected revenge killing. Henry Borelli's brother Vincent disappeared that same year. One by one, the loose ends of the DeMeo crew were cut. By the end of the decade, the Gemini Lounge was closed, the landfill at Fountain Avenue sealed, and most of the men who had lived off DeMeo's blood money were either dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. In 1989, an FBI agent who had chased the crew for nearly 10 years summed it up best. They killed for money, then for loyalty, then for nothing at all. In the end, they couldn't tell the difference. The DeMeo crew was finished. A story written in greed, paranoia, and the kind of violence that eventually devours its own. Long after the bodies stopped surfacing and the indictments faded from the headlines, the name Roy DeMeo refused to disappear. His story, stitched together from testimony, rumor, and police reports, became one of organized crime's darkest legends. A portrait of how ambition, money, and murder could fuse into something mechanical. In 1992, crime journalists Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capeci published Murder Machine, a book that stripped away the myth and laid bare the horror of what DeMeo's crew had done. It drew from trial transcripts, FBI files, and the words of the men who'd once worked beside him. The title came from the nickname detectives had whispered among themselves: a machine, built to kill efficiently, without emotion, and without end. The book became a cornerstone of modern true crime reporting, the definitive account of the Gemini Lounge years. A decade later, in 2002, DeMeo's own son, Albert, published For the Sins of My Father. It was a different kind of confession, not from a killer, but from a child who had watched one across the dinner table. Albert wrote about the nights his father came home silent and bloodstained, about the fear that followed the family long after the guns went quiet. His memoir gave the story something rare in the world of organized crime, a glimpse of the human wreckage left behind. Hollywood came calling soon after. The DeMeo legend echoed through film and television. He was depicted in Boss of Bosses 2001, a biopic about Paul Castellano's reign and fall, shadowed in The Iceman 2012, where actor Ray Liotta's portrayal of DeMeo captured the calm menace behind the smile, and reimagined in Inside Man 2003 and countless documentaries, each retelling the story with a mix of fascination and dread. Meanwhile, the Gemini Lounge, the small bar on Flatlands Avenue where it had all begun, was given a new life. The same walls that once hid murder and dismemberment were renovated into a Christian church, its windows repainted, its floors polished. The pulpit stood where the freezer once did. To the neighborhood, it became a symbol of redemption, a quiet effort to reclaim something that could never truly be washed clean. Today, nearly half a century later, Roy DeMeo's name lives in both worlds, the underworld he helped build and the cultural one that keeps retelling it. He's become a cautionary figure, proof that intelligence without conscience can be as deadly as any gun. The Gemini Lounge may now echo with hymns, but the story it birthed still hums beneath Brooklyn's streets, a reminder that power bought in blood never really fades, it only changes form. Behind the blood and business, Roy DeMeo tried to live the life of an ordinary man. He married Gladys Britton in the early 1960s, a quiet woman from Brooklyn who stood by him even as the whispers about her husband grew louder. Together, they bought a home in Massapequa Park, Long Island, a neighborhood of trimmed lawns and cul-de-sacs, far from the noise of Flatlands. To the neighbors, Roy was a successful businessman who dealt in cars and finance. He drove Cadillacs, hosted backyard barbecues, and paid his bills on time. No one saw the weapons hidden in the house or the body armor hanging in his closet. To his family, he was both protector and stranger, a man who loved them fiercely, yet vanished for nights without explanation. Gladys knew not to ask questions. She ran the home, raised their 3 children, and tried to keep the family normal in a world built on secrecy. Roy was strict but affectionate. He coached Little League, attended school events, and handed out cash like gifts as if money could buy back all the time he spent away. Their eldest son, Albert, was his father's shadow, sharp, observant, and loyal. Roy brought him into small errands, let him ride along to business meetings, and taught him that fear was weakness. To Albert, those moments felt like bonding. Only years later did he realize what he'd been seeing. After Roy's murder in 1983, the family imploded. The news coverage, the whispers, the FBI visits, it all tore at what little peace they had left. Gladys retreated inward, avoiding interviews and reporters. Albert, still a teenager, carried the weight of his father's legacy alone. He joined the military, then worked on Wall Street, always trying to live outside the shadow of the DeMeo name. But ghosts follow blood. Albert battled depression and guilt for years. In his 2002 memoir, For the Sins of My Father, he wrote about the fear that lived in their home, the way he'd hear his father's car pull in late at night and smell bleach before bed. He described Roy not as a monster, but as a man divided between tenderness and violence. "He loved us," Albert wrote, "but he loved control more." The DeMeo family never found closure. There were no memorials, no graveside confessions, just silence, the same silence Roy had demanded from everyone around him. In the end, the story of Roy DeMeo's family isn't about crime. It's about what happens when a man builds a wall between love and fear and brings both home every night. His wife lost her husband to the life. His children lost their innocence to it. And for them, the Gemini Lounge was never a crime scene. It was a shadow that followed them forever. Between 1973 and 1983, the DeMeo crew left a trail of death that no one could count with certainty. Detectives, years later, would estimate between 70 and 200 people vanished at their hands. Most were never found. The rest surfaced in fragments: a leg in a dumpster, a skull in the landfill, a name whispered in a courtroom. Each killing had a reason: money, fear, betrayal. Sometimes nothing at all. What follows is the story of those years told in blood and silence, the victims of Roy DeMeo's murder machine. The first known body was Paul Rothenberg, a small-time film distributor who handled the kind of adult reels that changed hands in backrooms and warehouses. When police seized his records, Rothenberg hinted he might talk. In 1973, his body turned up in pieces, stabbed, dismembered, and left for the city's sanitation trucks to collect. It was an early warning. Silence wasn't a choice. It was survival. Next came Andrei Katz, the mechanic who thought he could outsmart the streets. Katz had partnered with DeMeo in a car theft ring, then flipped when the law closed in. Lured by a woman he trusted, he ended up in the meat locker of a Rockaway supermarket, stabbed, butchered, and dumped in garbage bags. When police found his remains, they didn't realize they were looking at a blueprint, the start of what would become the Gemini method. Through the mid-70s, names disappeared. Paul "Paulie" Mirror, a Gambino associate who'd been skimming profits, vanished after a meeting at the Gemini Lounge. Mickey Spillane, the Irish boss of Hell's Kitchen, was gunned down in 1977, a political favor, some said, for Jimmy Coonan and the Westies. DeMeo's name was whispered around that one, too. By 1978, the killing had moved closer to home. Edward "Danny" Grillo, once a hijacker for the crew, fell into debt and out of favor. He walked into the Gemini Lounge one night and never came out. The next morning, the bar opened on time, and the street went about its business. Then came the mistake. Dominic Ragucci, a college kid selling door-to-door in Massapequa Park, crossed paths with DeMeo's paranoia. Roy thought the boy was a Cuban hitman sent after him. He chased him through the suburbs and shot him dead. Only afterward did he realize what he'd done. It was the one killing that ever broke him. That same year, DeMeo killed his protege, Chris Rosenberg, the kid he'd raised, the kid he trusted. Rosenberg had brought too much heat with a drug deal gone bad in Florida. Paul Castellano gave the order. Roy pulled the trigger. The body was left in a car on Cross Bay Boulevard, where the cops would find it before dawn. Soon after came the Eppolitos, father and son, both made men who accused Nino Gaggi of dealing drugs. DeMeo and Gaggi lured them to Coney Island, shot them in the head, and left them in their car. It was the kind of killing that carried weight inside the family, blood washing blood. The early 80s brought a new kind of murder, cleanup jobs tied to the car theft empire. Two civilians who knew too much about the shipping racket vanished without a trace. Others followed: thieves, dealers, anyone who even looked like a threat. Some names were never confirmed: a Bonanno associate rumored to have stolen from DeMeo, a cousin of Henry Borelli who talked too freely, a low-level courier who tried to skip town. They all disappeared into the landfill at Fountain Avenue, the crew's private cemetery. And then came the final name: Roy Albert DeMeo. The man who taught them how to kill was killed by his own men, lured to a meeting at Patty Tester's home, shot in the head, left in the trunk of his Cadillac, parked in the cold of Sheepshead Bay. In 10 years, the DeMeo crew turned murder into procedure. The Gemini Lounge became their assembly line. The landfill became their monument. When investigators finally mapped it all out, one agent said it best. They didn't kill for power. They killed to keep the machine running, and when it stopped, it ate its own. That was Roy DeMeo's legacy. Not the money, not the cars, not the fear he inspired. It was the silence that followed him and the bodies that kept it. Over the decade, the FBI estimated the DeMeo crew may have been responsible for between 75 and 200 murders. Some were business, debtors, rivals, witnesses. Others were personal. A few were simply examples, warnings to the living. Almost none were solved in their time. The evidence was gone before the blood was dry, and the witnesses ended up buried beside the truth. The landfill at Fountain Avenue became their unmarked cemetery. For years, police cadaver dogs turned up bone fragments and teeth beneath the soil. Most couldn't be matched to names. Those who studied the case later said the DeMeo crew represented the perfect evolution of organized violence, a group that had turned killing into process, crime into logistics. And when it ended, there was nothing left to show for it but empty docks, a shuttered bar, and a church standing on ground that had once smelled of bleach.